We are in Esther chapter 6. Lesson 9 of our study. Anybody got a page number for me? What's that? Page 70. Hopefully you already knew that. But if you didn't, or if you lost your place, page 70, lesson 9, the king and Mordecai. So, recap. The book of Esther is really telling one main story, one event that happened in the history of God's people. And to put it one way, as our book puts it, it tells the story of how Esther, Queen Esther, acted at least to save her people, the Jewish people, from destruction. Everything that we've been looking at, and the last couple lessons we really noticed, it really got into it about this plot unfolding. But in this narrative, there are other little plot lines going on. Will King Xerxes treat Esther the way he treated the last queen? That's sort of hanging in the air. We don't know yet. So far, it's going good. But remember where we left it off last week, she hasn't told him what she needs yet. She's putting it off. And she's being very careful. Will the tension between Mordecai and Haman be resolved? That's definitely hanging around. Will the Persian king acknowledge and reward Mordecai for saving his life? However long ago that was. That's really going to come back in this lesson. And what role did God play in the events that we've been studying that are recorded in this book? Well, in Esther 6 and 7, we get the answers to some of these questions. Especially, we're going to see more of God's providence. He's working. This is one of my favorite sections of the book of Esther in the question of God's providence. Sure, it doesn't have that big-time quote of Mordecai, who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for just this exact time. But this is one of my favorite sections where we see a domino effect of events that have no explanation whatsoever except something bigger's going on here. It slows down a little bit, but in a good way. So, this is going to cover all of chapter 6 and all of chapter 7, by the way. So here's what we read. As last week, Haman went home, bragged on himself, but then he said, I can't even be happy about it because Mordecai the Jew is still around. So his lovely wife and his lovely friends said, why don't you just build a gallows, a stake, if you will, a tree, erect a wooden thing, hang him on it, and go off to the feast happy. So that's where it left off. Actually, it left off by saying Haman liked that idea and he built it. So that's the last thing we read in chapter 5. Then in chapter 6 we read this. Now the scene changes. I've told you before, it's just the way my mind works, but I see it play out, especially books like Esther, because it's so easy to see it like a movie, the camera's there. Now the scene shifts from Haman's house and Haman having this thing built. I'm sure he didn't touch a single piece of wood in the building of it. He had it built. The scene shifts to that same night, later in the night, the wee hours of the morning, to the king's bedroom. And this is what we read. On that night, the king could not sleep. This is about to set off this domino effect of providential activity. Way too much to be coincidence. This is what kicked it off. On that particular night, remember they had their banquet, the queen and the king and Haman had this dinner. He said, okay, what is it, Esther? She said, I'd like you to come tomorrow to another banquet, another lunch, another feast, and then I'll tell you. So they go home. Now, that night, the king just couldn't sleep. No, we're not given any sort of explanation. Did the king normally have trouble sleeping? I don't know. But he couldn't sleep this night. So much so that he knew he wasn't going to go back to sleep. You ever wake up and, before the sun comes up at some point, you know you're not going to go back to sleep? I have trouble sleeping myself. Sometimes I wake up and I can tell if I'm going to go back to sleep just by the way, I don't know how it works. My brain is so muddy and foggy. I know I don't have to worry about it. I know I'm about to be asleep before I can even decide to get up. Other times, I'll lay there and I finally realize, yep, my brain's waking up too much. I'm not going to go back to sleep, so I might as well get up. That's what the king, this is the kind of night he's having. He couldn't sleep, and he knew there's nothing for me to do. I might as well, if I'm going to be sitting here awake, or lying here awake, I might as well get up and get some work done. That seems to be what's happening here, because then next what he did was he gave orders for the book of memorable deeds to be brought in, the Chronicles. Now, I've joked about this before that, what better way to fall asleep on a sleepless night than to come and have somebody read you a book of memorable deeds. That'll put you right to sleep. That's like NyQuil. Extra strength NyQuil. You read a book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles of Memorable Deeds. But, I don't think he was trying to get back to sleep. I think he was just trying to occupy himself while he's awake. There are going to be some servants awake no matter what. So he goes in and gets up. And because it wasn't like it was 1 in the morning or anything. We're going to learn here in a second that it was more like the sun was soon to come up, or maybe was already starting to come up or something like that by the time what we're about to read happened. So he said, bring the book of the memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and read them. And that's what he did, the servant did. And here's the next domino. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about those 2 of the king's eunuchs who sought to lay hands on the king. He found written, it just so happened, that in this book of memorable deeds, the section that the servant chose to read also included how Mordecai that day had saved the king's life because he overheard the 2 eunuchs talking that they're going to assassinate the king, and he saved his life. And the king said, well, this needs to be rewarded. And he asked, has anything been done? What's been done for this man to bestow honor on him for having done this? Because I kind of like it when people save my life. So I want to give them the most reward they can get to encourage other people to save my life. If they can have a chance to save my life, don't give him too much credit. This is all about him, in one way or another. And to his displeasure, he heard nothing's been done. Hadn't got around to that one yet. Well, this can't stand. This can't be. So he's going to seek some advice, as he did before, and as so many kings in the Old Testament did, whether they sought advice from reputable sources or not. They would get their wise men, they would get their advisors, they would get the men who were supposed to know what they were talking about. But remember, it's very early in the morning at this point. Maybe still dark, but not too early for one man. He said, well, who's in the court? The king said. Who's here? Who we got to work with? Who's here? Just so happened, another domino. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak with the king. And in case your memory isn't working too well, he was there to speak to the king about hanging that Jew Mordecai. Why was Haman there, in the dark of morning? Well, because it makes perfect sense to me. I wouldn't expect him to do any different. He was going to get there. You see, the king probably had people coming every day. Because we take for granted, I think sometimes, yes, it's hard to get things done at times, even in our system of government. It's hard to get anything heard, have something heard, or something to. It goes through all these loops and hurdles. But back then, under a monarchy like this, all you got's the king. And if you need something to be decided about anything, you're going to have to go to the court, and the royal court. That's what they called, the king, where the king sits, and he will take people to hear, okay, what's your problem? Your neighbor stole some sheep, or whatever. Okay, do this, rectify this situation like that. Who's here? Haman just got there shortly before this started to happen, or shortly before he asked who's here. Yes, Dean? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, he wanted it done as soon as possible, but he also didn't want to have to wait in line. So he's going to get there super early. It's like the day after Christmas at Walmart. The worst day of the year. Way worse than Black Friday, in my opinion. But if it's so bad is because every single person and their cousin, every cousin and brother and dog has something to return to Walmart the day after Christmas. If you need something to return, you better get there early, because it's the only day of the year Walmart closes, as far as I know, except maybe this year. But anyway, as a rule. So everybody's piled up there. You want to get there as early as possible. Or some people might do that at, like for a concert or something. If you got floor tickets, you want to get there as early as possible, because first come, first serve kind of thing. Haman is there probably for that kind of reason. He wants to be the first person, or among the first, to talk to the king, because he's got some serious business he's got to handle. And because of that, he just happened to be the one who was there when the king said, who we got? Who's around? Anybody up? Anybody awake? Haman just walked in. He said, all right, bring him in. Haman comes in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? It kind of almost sounds like a riddle when you read it like that, or a parable. It's not a riddle. He's just saying, we have somebody that is overdue to have an honor bestowed on him. What do you think we ought to do? You got any ideas or suggestions, or what do you think? Now, this is amazing. This maybe shows the character of Haman more than anything else that happens. Haman said to himself, or as we would put it, he thought to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? In other words, he thinks that he's talking about him. He's going to bestow an honor on me. Now, we talked about how narcissistic Haman was. This takes the cake, I would think. He said, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And he just, for some reason, instantly thinks, it's got to be me. Who else would it be after all, And because of this misunderstanding, this misapprehension, He goes all out. He thinks, it's for me, I know it. It's almost like, somebody asks their spouse, what do you think I should get this person that I love for Christmas? And you're like, it's got to be me, Get him a new car. That's what I would do. And then the next thing you know, it's for his mom or something. Mom, here's your new car. And then her heart sinks like, oops, and then, she gets a greatest hits CD of some kind or something. Anyway, Haman said, he just leaves nothing, spares no expense. He says, here's his inventory, his list, his description. Here's what I think should be done. First of all, let the royal robes be brought, robes that you yourself, O king, have worn on your royal, glorious body. Let the horse that you have sat your glorious rear end on be brought for him to ride on. And the horse will be crowned with a royal crown. That's a phrase that's also, depending on your version, might be a little confusing. It's not talking about the man having the crown, but the horse on whose head the royal crown will be set, which was not unprecedented in that culture to have a crown on the horse. Haman didn't want to go too far after all, It's like, what do you want next? For everybody to call you king or something? Well, or call him king, because it's not really about Haman. So he says, then let one of the king's most notable officials, somebody real high up, that everybody knows is real high up, like the vice president, maybe, as we would say. Somebody that everybody knows is really close on the ladder to the king. Lead him on this horse around the square of the city, where the most people will be. And as he's leading him, he is to proclaim repeatedly, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. This is what will be done for those whom the king wants to honor, which in part was, again, to encourage, give an incentive for people to help the king out when they can, and in part more prideful narcissism on Haman's part, because he wants this really high up official to go around and lead him around and say, look who the king wants to honor, this guy. From his perspective, that would be what it is. So he just goes all out. This is so extravagant, so over the top. And who knows what the king was thinking. It's like, well, I kind of was thinking about, getting him a new horse or something, But okay, that'll do. So he says, fine, all right. Hurry up, take the robes and the horse and everything that you just said, and do exactly as you just said to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing. You don't leave out anything that you just said. And do it to Mordecai the Jew. What are the odds? From Haman's perspective. Now, we already knew it. We were told as the reader, that he found it written how Mordecai saved his life. What has been done for Mordecai? Nothing. Something needs to be done for Mordecai. Haman comes in. What do you think I ought to do for this man that I want to honor? Haman thinks it's himself, suggests this, and then his whole world comes tumbling upside down. Do what you just said. Great idea, Haman. That's really sweet of you. Now do that to Mordecai the Jew. This is one of those places where you just wish you could see his face when those words came out, and how dismayed he would have been. Absolutely devastated. You see all the irony here. Is to the maximum. Can't get any more ironic than this. Or can you? Because maybe it will. Now, Oh, got ahead a little bit. To Haman's credit, and you know what, I don't even know if I want to say that much, but maybe not to his credit so much, maybe a little bit, but to our surprise maybe, he did it. He did everything.
Well, it would have really,
He had to.
yeah, say it. He
He shot himself in the foot, as we would say. He tied his own hands. His hands were tied of his own making. It would have been devastating enough if he just found out it wasn't him. But of all the people in the kingdom, it was Mordecai the Jew that was to be honored. Verse 11 says, so Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed. Oh, I forgot that part. That high up official was to dress him himself. You ever watch old period pieces and stuff of royalty and everything, or even rich people? They can't even put their own clothes on. It's kind of pathetic, you know. I would never want somebody to put my pants on for me or stuff. You know, it's weird. If I can do it myself, it's a servant's job. You see that they would have servants or slaves even put their clothes on for them. So he built it in here that this high up official was going to dress him like a servant. And now he's doing that. He's dressing Mordecai in the king's robe. He's going to get him on the king's horse and sit him on the king's saddle. And he leads him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. He takes him through the whole city. And all we get is one verse. Again, what would his face have looked like? And the scene going on around him, there's people hustling and bustling around. Everybody's going to stop and, whatever they're doing, what's going on here? Maybe people cheering for the one on the horse, hip hip hooray kind of thing, admiring, at least distracted, and all the while Haman's leading that horse. And I bet his face could have made somebody look away, probably. Like, I don't want to cross this guy. He is, oof. Probably wasn't too enthusiastic as he's proclaiming this about Mordecai. So, he did exactly as he described. Well, after it was done, Mordecai, he just goes back to where he was. Returned back to where he always is. All right, that's over. It's kind of an inconvenient, interruption of my day. Okay, going back to normal. At the king's gate. Not so with Haman, though. By the way, if you didn't notice, Haman never got to bring up what he went there for. He was there to have Mordecai killed. Instead, he ended up having Mordecai honored in front of everybody and at his own expense. Personally, socially, or whatever, emotionally. He does not just go back to his normal place. He doesn't show back up at the king's gate or the king's court to say, oh, remember I had something I wanted to talk to you about. This has kind of just foiled his whole thing, his whole plan in a way. How could he bring up hanging this man that he's just been commanded by the king to honor and lead through the city because he saved his life? Totally ruined his whole plan. So what do you think Haman might have done then? Well, I'll tell you what he did. Verse 12. He hurried to his house. He probably had his head, I can't get out of the public quick enough. He ran home, mourning, and with his head covered. When's the last time we read in this story, in this account, somebody mourning with their head covered in, sackcloth and ashes? Well, okay. Wasn't the last time because if you count Esther's feast, Esther's fast. But Mordecai, and he was in that condition because he heard that his people were going to be destroyed. Haman, what happened to him? Nothing. It wasn't even about him, was it? A humble man would have been glad to honor somebody who saved the king's life. It's not about him. Of course, any of it that was about him was his own doing, because he wanted to humiliate also whoever the king's servant was that was going to be honoring him. And, you know, he inherently built into it, I'm better than you, this high up official. So in that sense, it was about him. But really, as far as anybody else cared, it had nothing to do with Haman. He was just the one that the king told, honor this man who saved my life. But to Haman, this was the end of the world. He just couldn't take it. So he ran home to his lovely wife and his friends. Now we're kind of back to where we were. Yesterday, he went home after the feast to tell them how great, you're never going to believe. Now, he's running for another pity party of sorts. He ran home, told them everything that happened. Now it's, you're not going to believe what happened to me today. Then, it says, interesting little thing you might easily pass over. Verse 12 says he went home and told his wife and all his friends everything that happened. Then the next clause, the next sentence in that verse says, then his wise men and his wife. So was there another group of men there, or were his friends these wise men, But here's the most interesting thing about this. Their tone has significantly changed. Something happened that led them to totally change their tune. If you go back to chapter 5, verse 14, and he tells them, remember we talked about how it's kind of like Jezebel and Ahab. He's like, what are you so worried about? Just kill him and be done with it. Won't have to look at him ever again. So they're enabling and encouraging him to pursue his, insatiable lust for himself, basically. Now, all of a sudden, he tells them everything, and he might have expected them to say, hey, you already got the thing built, What are you doing here? Get yourself in there and get him on that thing, dead. But instead, they said this, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, there's an interesting phrase, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. No explanation whatsoever given for where did this come from? Just in case we get distracted by the fact that they said, oh, if he's a Jew, then you're in big trouble. Because remember, they already knew he was a Jew. He said, as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew sitting there, I can't take it anymore. Or nothing's good. Yeah, Wes? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, in this, he's already settled the Jews' fate with that law that was passed. That's in motion now, no matter what anybody does. But as far as this additional thing that he's made it about him and Mordecai, maybe the thing that these wise men were seeing and interpreting as an evil omen was what he just told them. This kind of like we emphasized already. What are the odds? He goes there to have Mordecai killed. And the king just happened to not be able to sleep, and just happened to want the book of memorable deeds to be brought and read, and just happened to be found where Mordecai had saved his life, and just happened to be discovered that nothing had been done to honor him. See this domino effect? Maybe these wise men saw that and thought, this is too much. Something, if I were you, I would just leave that man alone. Based on what we've heard here, I don't think you need to get involved. Leave it. After all, in less than 11 months now, unless he stops being a Jew, in the next 10 months, he's dead meat anyway, because the law's already been set in motion. It really reminds me, what they said reminds me of what Gamaliel spoke up and said in the book of Acts about to the other men of the council, the Jewish council, or whoever was involved in that. And Gamaliel was the voice of reason in a sense, and he said, take care what you're about to do. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it'll fail. But if it's from God, you will not succeed. I get some echoes of that in this. Be careful, because maybe his wife and these wise men, his friends, maybe this is just another subtle instance of somebody acknowledging maybe something bigger's going on here. I don't like the sound of this. In their case, it was a bad thing, because any divine activity was not in their favor. It's, in this case, against them. But it's still maybe a subtle acknowledgement of something bigger's going on here. If I were you, I'd leave it. You better not, do not proceed. You will fall. And that's why I said it's interesting, is that they said, you have already begun to fall before Mordecai. This is the day that you started falling. If not before, this was a major turning point. You better leave this. And it seems that he may have given in a little bit. That leads us to the last verse, which sets up, talk about great timing. He's just had the worst day of his life, the worst morning of his life. He's absolutely devastated. He probably wants to curl up into a ball and lay in bed all day, maybe all week. But now, guess what? While they're talking, some of the king's eunuchs are knocking at the door, and they said, come on, Haman, time to go to the feast, the banquet. See, we forgot all about the banquet. He's got to go to lunch again with the king and the queen. So he's got to put on his face, his political face, whatever, in the worst mood ever. And so now he's on his way to have this banquet. He's in shambles, basically. He's a mess. Well, so here they go. The king and Haman went to feast with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking after the feast, the king finally asked again, all right, here it is. The time has come. What do you want? What's your request? It will be granted to you. So on and so forth. She said, just as she promised, tomorrow I'll tell you. At the next feast you come, I will tell you. So she does. She says, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. We'll leave that part for now. Mainly, she spills it now. She says, what my request is I'm begging you, O king, for my own life to be spared. That's all I want, is to keep living. And my people. And here's what I'm talking about. We've been set up to be destroyed, exterminated, annihilated from the earth. And she just, the last phrase is extremely difficult on the surface, but the gist is pretty clear. She's basically saying, if it was just that we were going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't even have said anything. But we're not talking slavery, we're talking gone forever from the earth. Our lives taken from us. Well, this was a shock to the king. After all, this is the queen talking. Who on earth would have the nerve to threaten their queen and her people? Who is it? She didn't waste any time. She said, this guy right here, this wicked Haman. And there he is sitting there. He could see this coming as soon as she started talking. But you see, if you remember, one thing that Haman didn't know at the time, and this is not to his credit at all, but just to emphasize the shock that he must have been in, he had no clue that Esther was a Jew. He had no clue. Her connection to Mordecai. As politically astute he was, and was probably observant, beyond anything we could imagine in most cases and circumstances, he did not know Esther was a Jew. Nobody did until the law had already been put into place, and then she kind of started being less careful about it, and she revealed it to the king. Now she says, this wicked Haman is the one. Haman was terrified. And why wouldn't he be? The king was extremely angry. And I can't help but want to give him a little bit of credit here. Especially considering they were drinking wine after the feast and so on and so forth. In his anger, what he did immediately was he got up and he walked out of the room. Walked out to the garden. Walked out to the balcony. I don't know, something like that. He went out to get some fresh air. Ponder on this a little for a second. Think about it. Haman didn't go anywhere. He stuck around. Now, it's Haman and the queen in there. And let's be honest and to be fair, I'm sure there was some kind of servant standing around somewhere, at least guards, somewhere. But their business is not to do with anything that's happening in the room. They are just there for protection and whatever else. But anyway, the king's not in there. Haman goes over to her and he begs for his life. He knows he's toast. He will not survive this. He sees anyway. He knows the king, by the way. He knows the king probably better than most. And he saw something in the king when he got up and he walked out of the room that the king is going to kill him. I'm a dead man right now. And that's what we read there in verse 7. For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Well, now the king walks in. And we're not given a description of what exactly Haman was doing physically, except that he was begging for his life. But apparently it was extremely emphatic and extremely desperate. Maybe some clinging going on. He was within arm's reach, just like you might picture somebody falling down. Please, I'm begging. You've got desperation, extreme desperation. And the king walks in, and he sees this. And he misinterprets this as assault. Horrible timing. Haman, come on, man. You were just told, you just heard that the queen told the king that you put into action that you were going to kill her and her people. And you're going to put yourself in a position where you're going to let the king see you doing anything that could even remotely resemble a threat to the queen right there in person. So he says, well, now he's even going to assault the queen right here in front of me? In my own house? And by the time the word even came out of the king's mouth to take him away and to kill him, they already had a bag over his head. One of the king's eunuchs just happened to remember or hear, you know what, come to think of it, Haman had this gallows built to kill Mordecai. The king said, hang him on that. Simple as that. So guess what happened? They hanged Haman on the very gallows or stake that he had prepared to have Mordecai hanged on. That's why I said the irony couldn't get any stronger. Well, I think it kind of just did, a little bit at least. He's hanging there on that 50 foot or 50 cubit from the ground stake or tree or wooden beam on which he probably would have been attached, very similar to crucifixion, if not exactly crucifixion, because like we said, Persians invented crucifixion. It was their thing. All right, well, we're out of time, but yeah, reap what he sowed. Hey, yeah. Yeah, the worst morning of his life. What he didn't know is the last morning of his life. And all avoidable, all unnecessary. All he had to do was not be so proud and full of himself, and he never would have, Mordecai never, that chain of events would have never started. So the dangers of pride, the delicate way Esther handled all of it, but again, maybe the biggest lesson from this, God, you can't beat God. Can't run from God. Can't hide from God. You can't beat God. You can't beat Him in a fight. You can't beat Him in cards. You can't beat Him in anything, okay? So don't try. God was working. And even though everything seemed utterly, hopeless, it wasn't. God's working. Mordecai was saved. But remember, for the, sort of the cliffhanger, this is not the end. The king knows about it, but remember the laws of the Medes and Persians can't be revoked. So it's still in place that on that day, in a few months' time or several months away, the Jews were still going to be, there were going to be people coming out from the woodwork wherever to kill all the Jews. So that is still unresolved. So they got to come up, they got to find a way to stop that. The main villain is dead, but the law that he put into place is still in full effect.